It is well worth the wait and the patience. And we are connecting. That is music to my eyes and my ears. Yes. You had a
on 4. That's just
you, Joe.
we just can't seem to.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, Neil, but the connection is pretty crappy. But yes, I do hear you now, and I see you, and I think we're live.
Good. I'm not going to move. I'm going to stay right here, and I think you should do the same thing, which would be good.
Yes.
Joe, I appreciate you joining me here on episode 32. I've been a fan of your playing for a long time. I've been aware of your playing since I started playing drums in the 80s. And I remember, in fact, I have the Phil Collins Modern Drummer episode that has an interview with you in there, and I remember reading that when I first started playing, and I'm like, Joe La Barbera, look at that little Gretsch set. What is that? So it's an honor and a pleasure for me to virtually finally meet you, and I'm excited. I want to thank Andrew. Be all fan.
Well, you make an older drummer feel good with all that stuff, Neil. Thank you. Well, I agree with that. I had actually stopped touring in February of 2018. After 50 years of being out there, I don't know how else to explain it. I just didn't want to be away from home anymore. So I called my wife from Japan actually and said, you know what, this has got to be the last time to stay at home and work locally. And I'm on the faculty at Cal Arts. I've been there for 27 years. So I was doing Cal Arts. So I had the rest of that semester and the summer to get myself geared up for online classes, which I've been doing since then.
Oh, that is good. Oh man, that could not have been better timing on your part, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people were kind of caught flat-footed as to what am I going to do?
Oh.
What am I going to do? Income-wise, I don't know how people are surviving. You know.
I don't either. I mean, I don't know. I think it's better in Canada in terms of support for working people, and that includes. But down here, whatever they offer pretty quickly, and so people are hurting. Musicians are hurting across the board down here.
To hear the musicians, myself included, have been on the government support since March, and it has dropped a little teeny bit, but it's still very good, and it's enough to get us through paying bills and whatnot. But I really miss the playing and traveling and seeing my friends and playing music in front of
Yeah.
people, you know. When did things begin with you musically? So you grew up in upstate New York, and how old were you when you started playing drums? Was it music first? Was it drums first? Was it a combination of both?
It was music first. You know, my father was a musician. Um, he was what you would consider an amateur musician in the sense that he had a full-time day job as a engineer at the local hospital. But he always played music his whole life, and quite frankly, his story is far more interesting than mine. Believe me, it's amazing. But the fact is, when my brothers and I were born, we were born into a house full of instruments. Pat came first, of course, and his first lesson was on violin, and thank God he gave that one up because we'd be missing one of the great tenor players if he hadn't. And
Indeed.
John came along and he played the cornet. My father played everything, but in the family band, which was his vision, he played the keyboard, either the accordion or piano if there was one available. And so when I came along, there was really no decision. He brought me down into the room where we played, where the band practiced. There was a set of drums there, 1930s Leedy Reliance, 28-inch bass drum, tacked head tom-tom, wood blocks, chime, the whole setup for that era. That's what I learned to play the drums on. And then my mother, shortly thereafter, was taught. My father taught her how to play the string bass, and that was our band.
Where did your father learn all of this music?
See, now you're going to get into the
Oh,
interesting part, man. Because no, seriously,
right.
because my father was born in a village in Sicily called Cerda. It's about 45 kilometers from Palermo, in the mountains, small. And the prospects of becoming a musician there were slim to none, right? But as luck would have it, in fact, this is the best part of the story. When he was born, my grandmother took him around, walking him around town, and there was a fortune teller. This guy had a parrot on one shoulder and a stick with pieces of paper stuck to it. And for a penny, or the equivalent in lira, the parrot reached down and grabbed the fortune. Well, the parrot reached down and picked the fortune and said, he's going to be a musician. My grandmother had a fit, a musician, the guy's not going to have a real job, so it kind of it sent shockwaves through her. But my grandmother was also very, very motivated. And in Sicily in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they operated under a baronal system. So there was a baron. He owned all the land. The best you could hope for was to lease a plot of land, work the ground, and then give the baron either money or crops. My grandmother said, forget this, we're going to America. And she took the whole family and moved to this village in Western New York where we're from, Mount Morris. And that's where it begins for my father, in an orphanage in Tonawanda, New York. The reason he was sent to the orphanage was because when his father died, and he died quite young, my grandmother couldn't afford to support all of the children.
Right.
So he was placed in this orphanage, and this is where he learns music. He learns piccolo and baritone horn. And from there, it was him, really. It was my father who wanted to learn music. So he was taken out of the orphanage at 16, went to work on the railroad,
Wow.
and as a water boy, saved enough money to buy himself a clarinet. And he practiced in the caboose. And he worked his way from water boy all the way up to being an engineer on the train. And in that amount of time, he amassed all these different instruments and taught himself along the way, taught himself all the woodwinds, all the brass. I mean, we literally had every instrument, at least one, most times two, of every instrument in the house when we were born. So it was predetermined we were going to be in music one way or another.
That is unbelievable. Man, I hope that you've kept some kind of story, written this down as much as you can, because that would be fascinating. That's like That's right out of a movie, and what a story. So how old would you have been when you started playing drums and or other instruments?
5 years old for the drums, and then when my embouchure was fully formed, my father started me on clarinet and saxophone, which I played through grade school and high school. You know, so I mean, I played more saxophone in my high school years than in school than the drums. So I was playing the drums on the outside, but yeah.
That's
So
great. Our,
yeah.
our a guest here, Lucas von Gretsch from the Gretsch family, has a question. Said, did your dad ever reconnect with your mom?
With my mother?
Said reconnect. So he wrote, did your dad ever reconnect with his mom, or with? I'm not sure what he means by that. With his with
Oh,
with.
he may have misunderstood that the family was separated. So when he was taken out of the orphanage and went to work on the railroad, that was because at 16 years old he was allowed to earn a living wage, which supported the household. So he was living with my grandmother. And here's another interesting story. When my father was, I think, 11 yeah, before he went into the orphanage, the circus came through town and they needed a baritone horn player. So it had to be after the orphanage, actually. The circus came through town and they needed a baritone horn player. And so my father went down and played. And then they wanted him to go on the road. Now he's underage, right? My grandmother had to lock him in the closet until the circus left town. But she later reminded him about the parrot and the prediction and said, I never thought this would happen for you, but clearly music was you were meant to be involved in music. Yeah, my grandmother actually lived with us in the house until very late in her life when she had to be institutionalized, but with dementia. But yeah.
What an unbelievable story,
Yeah,
Joe.
I
So
told you
far.
it was more interesting than me.
And well, I don't know, but your experience is pretty amazing. What were
Yeah.
you playing in the family band? What kind of music were you playing? Were you playing jazz?
That's another really good point because my father's library was so extensive, Neil. First of all, he directed park bands, so he had light classics for most communities had a park band back then. We're talking the 20s and the 30s, so he had that music, that repertoire. We had Fletcher Henderson, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Count Basie arrangements that could be condensed for a five-piece band. We had all the Italian polkas and mazurkas. We played all of that. But years later, as I thought back on it, because I started teaching jazz history at Cal Arts in '96, I think, I realized that the band we had was modeled after the early jazz bands. My brother John played cornet,
Yep.
not trumpet.
Yep.
My brother Pat played clarinet and saxophone. My father was playing the piano. My mother was playing the bass, and I was playing the drums. And we were playing the music of Fletcher Henderson, of Count Basie, Glenn Miller, Duke Ellington with this ensemble. So I was getting and the way I played the drums back then was in the style of Baby Dodds, where you kept time on the snare drum. So it was that style of drumming for initially.
Did you like that music?
Yeah, I mean, because that was the most fun to play. I liked it all, but I mean, I think I liked the swing music best because there were opportunities for little drum breaks here and there, and little solos. And of course, what kid doesn't want to have people pay attention to him? And I'm back there whacking away at stuff, and you know. In fact, hold on a second. Back then, this is a leady lightweight pedal, and you see this thing right here. You'd have a cymbal mounted to the bass drum loop, and when you do that, it would hit the cymbal. I'm sorry, Neil, I missed your question because I stepped away.
No, that is unbelievable. Did you have drum heroes growing up? Were you aware of drummers or?
Yeah, in 1950s. Well, we were listening to my father had a number of 78s with Benny Goodman, the band with Krupa and Charlie Christian and Teddy Wilson. And so we were listening to some of those tracks, and of course I was aware of Gene Krupa. And as luck would have it, in 1958, believe it or not, we had a little club in Mount Morris. The son of the owner was also a drummer, and we're still good friends to this day. And he booked real jazz into that club, like Terry Gibbs and the Soft Winds with Herb Ellis and Ray Brown. But he booked Krupa in there twice. And for one of those engagements, my father, I was only 7, but my father took me down to the hotel on an afternoon matinee and walked me into the bar for about 5 minutes and hoisted me up on his shoulder. And I just have this image of Gene Krupa up there wailing away with Eddie Shue on tenor and Dave McKenna on the piano. So no bass, just a trio.
Unbelievable. This is one of the reasons why I'm so glad that I speak with artists like you, because I can live vicariously and experience this a little bit secondhand. And this is absolutely amazing. So how long did the family band continue? And yeah, and where would you play?
There were a couple of places we played. The main one was a hotel in New York, and we probably worked every Saturday because people were getting married, just a week. So we were called most times to go and play at the weddings. There was another place nearby in another community, just about 3 miles away, that we used to play. My father found gigs for the American Legion, for the Firemen's Association, anything like that that required music. My father was the go-to guy, for a band. So we worked quite a bit. The band stayed together till probably 1962, and
Okay.
then my brother Pat started bringing home the modern jazz records, and our interest started to change, and we started to move away from that. And I think the gigs started to dry up a little bit back then as well. I'm not 100% sure, but when Pat started bringing home Coltrane and Miles Davis, that kind of changed things, and so we started to find our own way with the music, and that was fine. It was time, I guess.
Yep. Yep. Were you aware of Gretsch drums at that point? And if not, when did they become part of your world, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, I remember watching I Love Lucy, and there's little Ricky, and he's got a set of Gretsch, those black diamond drums, right? So I love the look. I love the way those look. Elvis Presley's drummer back then was using Gretsch. I think most of the guys were playing Gretsch, until Ringo went on Ed Sullivan with those Ludwigs, and that kind of changed things. But the first drummer I actually saw live with a set of Gretsch was Steve Gadd, and this would have been 1960. I want to say 64. He had just turned 18, and he was of legal age to be able to play in clubs, and he was working with Chuck and Gap Mangione, the Jazz Brothers. And he had that same set of drums as Little Ricky, the Black Diamond, big 22-inch bass drum, 13, 16. And he was playing his ass off back then. I was 15 at the time, and I'm listening to this guy thinking, holy mackerel. But yeah, he was the first one that I actually saw with Gretsch.
That's amazing. Can you imagine if he'd have stayed with Gretsch and how things might have been a little bit different? But yes, Steve's done okay for himself, and man, influenced a whole generation. Yeah,
Oh,
that is
I mean,
fabulous.
he's one, yeah, he's one of the greats, all-time greats. And, I mean, his decision to move away from Gretsch, I think, was based primarily on a sound that he was hearing. And that gets back to, really the essence of why we all love Gretsch so much. If there's a particular sound that you're after, then there's only one brand that can actually deliver on that front. There are a lot of imitators. There are a lot of drums that model themselves after Gretsch. In fact, I would say 90% of the companies out there today model themselves after the Gretsch model, with the die-cast hoops and the plied shells. That's Gretsch innovation. But when you really want a specific sound, and I know you do, that's got to be Gretsch.
Joe, do you remember when you got your first set of Gretsch drums?
I certainly do. It was my the second semester of my first year at Berkeley College. Jack's drum shop was down in the what they called the combat zone. And I went down there and I met Jack Adams, the owner, and Freddie Sargent, who was working there. Freddie went on to work for Zildjian after that for many, many years. Anyway, there was a set of Gretsch there that he had. And, he said, if you pay me installments, you can have these drums. So I started giving him $25, whenever I would do a gig. I think that's what gigs were paying back then. I'd give him $25. Now the whole set back then, 4 drums was, I think, a whopping $225, So by the time I had given him about $75 or $80, I went in with my money, said, here, take them. I trust you. Imagine that, So, I paid off that drum set and had those drums for many years. I still had the snare drum, which was a chrome over brass snare drum. The other drums, unfortunately, were stolen out of the trunk of my car in New York City many years ago. But that chrome over brass drum still sounds amazing.
I bet. Oh, what an amazing story. Yeah, nothing like trust back then, trusting that you are going to pay in installments. And my mom and my stepdad actually went to Jack's drum shop over 30 years ago and brought me back the sticker, and they brought me back some things. They went to Berkeley to visit because that was a school I wanted to go to but didn't. But I have some mementos from Jack's drum shop sticker and things, and I certainly love a lot of Gretsch history and knowing about different well-known shops and things. What was Berkeley like for you? You spent a couple of years there. What was the experience like for you?
It was pretty amazing. First of all, the faculty was all pros, right? You had Herb Pomeroy, John Laporta, Andy McGee, Phil Wilson, Jimmy Mosier, Ray Santisi, Alan Dawson. Yep. Did I say John Neves on bass? It's just an incredible faculty. Pat's saxophone teacher, Joe Viola, was not known as a jazz player, but he helped my brother tremendously. And my brother John, studying arranging with I had arranging with Phil Wilson. I think John might have had it with John Laporta. Just a great school and a great vibe. And then there's the whole networking thing, because when I think back to my classmates, I mean, Harvey Mason and I were there together. Harvey was a year ahead of me. He transferred over to New England because they gave him a full ride. Gene Roma, another good bud, he was there with me. Rick Laird on bass, Miroslav Vitos on bass, George Mraz was there for a while. I mean, I think he finished up. Mick Goodrick, John Abercrombie, Richie Byrack,
wow,
Ernie Watts.
Who's who?
I'm telling you. And so, I mean, these are people that I still maintain contact with today, So it was an incredible environment, and it was a small school at that time. In 1966, when I started, I think the entire student body was 900 students.
Wow!
So it's quite small. You had excellent student to teacher ratio.
Now you mentioned Alan Dawson. Was that Alan that was the instructor there?
Yes.
Is that where you get your beautiful left hand from, or was that from someone else? Your left hand, I'm telling you, I've been watching videos, and we must, if you would have me, I'd love to do a virtual lesson with you, because I've never had anybody really, except a little bit with Jim Blackley, talk about this. But did you learn that technique from AD?
Yeah, I learned so much from Alan, man. I mean, he had a very comprehensive approach, but I used to watch him when he would play, and his thumb would be up in the air like that. And we talked about it. He said, I only use the thumb to keep the stick from sliding backward or forward.
Yeah.
It's the fingers and the wrists that are doing all of the, all of the motion. And so I paid close attention to that. But the things he had me doing out of stick control and out of the syncopation book, they really transformed my technique. I mean, I had really had no formal drum instruction prior to entering Berkeley College. My father showed me how to hold the sticks, and he sat me down at the drums and showed me a couple of beats, but that was the extent of it. So Alan really, he went back and filled in a lot of gaps for me as a percussionist, as a drummer. And also Fred Buddha, who was also on the faculty. Yeah. So between the two of them, man, I was so fortunate to be there at that time.
Wow, what an experience. And we haven't even talked about your playing very much. So, and I know you did, that's what I was saying. I was writing the questions and I'm like, we're not going to get through this. We're not going to get through this. We may have to do part 2 at some point. But I wanted to ask you, so you did a stint in the Army.
Right.
Were you playing music in the Army? What did you do then?
I actually was drafted in '69, and I managed to finagle my way into the post band there. So really, what we did was we were housed in the induction area, which is where all the incoming troops came in. It's where I came in. We would play all the induction ceremonies, so those were weekly. A new set of recruits would be brought in.
Yeah.
We'd play the induction ceremony. We would do a lot of parades like Philadelphia and Camden, New Jersey, any of the outlying areas. We had a detail, sadly, that was called the bugle detail. What those poor guys had to do was play funerals. And if you remember back, well, in 1969 and the early, all throughout the late 60s and the early 70s, there was a massive death toll in the military. So I would occasionally go out with a bugle or with a snare drum. We'd play funerals, whatever was required. We played gigs at the office club, and then if we could find a gig side of that, we'd work around the area. But the main benefit for me was that Fort Dix, New Jersey, which is where I was stationed the entire time, was only 90 miles from New York City. So it was a short bus ride into town, and I would hear some incredible music.
Incredible. That's incredible. What was the first major gig that you landed? Was it Woody Herman after the Army? Was it the Woody Herman gig?
Well, actually, it was before the Army, because in January of '68, one of my faculty, Ted Howe, asked me if I wanted to go to Las Vegas for a month with the singer named Frankie Randall. And Frankie died unfortunately very young. He died about 3 years ago. He was a really good tenor, sang like Sinatra, that style, great ballads, also a Juilliard graduate, so he played the piano really well. So I went to Vegas for that month, and the reason I went was because it was with Buddy Rich's band at the Sands for a month. And my brother Pat was already in the band, and my brother John joined shortly thereafter. So I spent the month of January in 1968 with Buddy's band in Las Vegas playing Frank's show. But also, Buddy was getting a lot of arrangements at that time in the book, and you probably know Buddy didn't read music, and he would just grab whoever was nearby. If there was a drummer, hey, you get up there, play these charts for me so I can hear them. And if you heard them one time, memorize. So I got to play that month for him.
That's unbelievable. Having to play in front of Buddy Rich. I don't know if I could come. Not the greatest drummer that ever lived, certainly one of them, that's amazing. What an experience, Joe. This is incredible. And we're only partway through your career thus far. Well,
I'm glad you're enjoying it, Neil. I look back at those memories pretty fondly now. It meant a lot to me. And that relationship with Buddy lasted right until he died because, even when I was in the Army, for example, he would, if he had back problems and his back was going on all the time,
Yeah.
they would get me out of duty, and I would go out for a weekend with the band, and Buddy would play the first set, and then he'd cool it, and I'd go out and play the second set. So that happened quite a few times, actually.
I read an article where you were talking about you were conscious of being loose and relaxed and conscious of the drum positioning and the setup, and that contributed, as well as your stretching and exercise regimen and things, to your longevity and your ability to basically be very healthy and playing into your 70s. So whereas Buddy was sitting so high, he was hunched over, that could have contributed most likely to having those back issues.
I would have to think that was partly responsible, Neil, because he played with such intensity, and I watched him night after night with that back kind of like this.
Yeah.
It's got to take a toll.
Yeah, oh, no doubt. What was the Woody Herman experience like?
Woody was great. I mean, since we were kids, my brothers and I, we listened to Woody's band, Maynard's band, you know, Basie's band, not so much, but we listened to Buddy and Woody, and we always wanted to be on those bands. And a number of musicians from Western New York, from Rochester, saxophone players primarily, Joe Romano, Sal Mystico. Sal's not from Rochester, but they had made a name for themselves on that band. So we thought this was something that was actually achievable. It was a realistic hope. And just prior to getting drafted, I got the call from Bill Byrne, Woody's manager, and I said, "Man, I'd love to do it, but I'm going in. I have to go in the Army." When I got out, they reached out again, and so that's when I joined, and it was an incredible experience. I mean, most of us that were with the band from anywhere between 1970 and 1980 will tell you that we learned the book by listening to Jake Hanna's records. The records with Jake. So you showed up already knowing half the book as it was, and then you could just learn whatever else there was. But Woody was, without a doubt, the most sympathetic and patient band leader you could ever hope for.
Well, that's and Jake was a beautifully swinging, lovely touch and a funny guy from what I've read. And he was good friends with Jim Blackley, whom I studied with for a few years, and
Yeah.
Jim had nothing but great things to say about Jake. That's wonderful. So what was the next? What was next in store? What was in store for you after the Army? What was some of your playing that you did?
When I got out of the Army, and just prior to the Army, I had. Sorry, man. Somebody just rang the doorbell. My wife's going to take care of it. So just prior to the Army and after, I was working with Chuck's brother, Gap Trio. The band before I went in was Tony Levin and Steve Gadd, and then Steve enlisted, so I took his place with Gap, and then I got drafted. It's the one without the tape. Thanks, babe. I took. Yeah, and so that was, and then when I got out, I worked with Gap for a bit, and then Woody, and then Gap's brother Chuck called me when I was on Woody's band and asked me if I wanted to join, because Steve was leaving his band. He had been playing with Chuck, so I jumped at that opportunity because, as much as I love big bands, I really wanted the opportunity to play with a small band and really grow as a part of a band like that, and that was an incredible experience.
Was there an audition, or did they just choose you?
I think at that point, I think Chuck had already known me long enough and heard me play enough that he was just able to say, you got it if you want it, so that worked out pretty easily. It was an easy transition, and yeah, I didn't have to audition necessarily.
Oh, that's amazing. What a wonderful time. I swear I was born too late. I'm 53 now, and I certainly would. I mean, I have so much vinyl here, jazz music. It's. I just wish that I was your age and grew up in that time and playing music like that. It's funny. I definitely feel like I'm uh, an older person sometimes inside. And my son's the same way. At 20, loves music from the 60s, which is pretty crazy. So,
Yeah.
um, what? How did the Bill Evans? We're moving ahead here. How did the Bill Evans gig come about?
I moved to New York in 1976. I left Chuck. I decided I wanted to go to New York. I thought if I'm going to do it, I got to do it now. I was 26,
Wow.
um, and I just said, I'm going. So I moved to New York, and I was very fortunate in that I started to work pretty quickly. I mean, there was some scuffling going on, but I mean, the first, the first, one of the first gigs I got was a week with Jim Hall and Michael Moore at a place called Sweet Basil. Bill Goodman, my friend for many, many years, it was his gig and he had a conflict, so he subbed it out to me. So that week did me a lot of good in terms of exposure, and I started to work more regularly because of that. And I had interacted with Bill a few times when I was with Gary Burton. We shared the same stage. When I was with Chuck, we shared the same stage. So he kind of knew kind of who I was. But the reason I got the call was because Bill used to go to the racetrack every once in a while with Joe Puma, the guitar player. They had been buds since Bill moved to New York, and they were racetrack buddies. And Bill said, Joe, I'm looking for a drummer. Do you know anybody? And I had been working a regular Monday night with Joe at a club called Jimmy Weston's uptown on the east side. So he said, well, you should check this guy out. So at the same time, he was working with Toots Thielman's making that record Affinity. And so Toots said, hey, I'm working over at this club called Hoppers with this drummer, Joe La Barbera. So Bill and Helen Keane showed up and they listened to me play and we met and spoke. And then shortly thereafter, Helen phoned and said, could you come down to the Vanguard next time we're playing there and audition. And so for that job, I actually had to audition.
What did you have to play for the audition?
Uh, I had to play a set. So I was working with Toots that's again in January when this happened. And Toots timed the sets so that I could finish at Hoppers, run across 12th Avenue to the Vanguard, down the stairs, on the stage, set the drums, and Bill just started playing. And so we played the set. And at the end of the set, he said, man, it sounds like you've been really listening to my music, and that is true. I had been listening to Bill. I was a huge fan since I was a teenager. I didn't know a lot of the specifics of some of the arrangements, but I certainly knew enough about how he played to be able to accompany him, and that was, I think, what he was really listening for.
Now you were already prepared for a gig like this. So do you feel that all of the years of playing in New York State, do you think that prepared you for when you went to New York, or were you still working on some things when you arrived in the city?
Well, yeah, I mean, I had a lot of experience by the time I moved to New York, Neil. But the fact is, you move and grow very quickly in that environment. It just there's such an intensity of playing and listening. I had a loft with Harold Danko, the piano player. We met in the Army, and we had a loft the 23rd to 7th. And that loft was designed for blowing because we had a stage with his grand piano on it, one of my drum sets, and a bass amp. So people were coming by all the time to blow. So you learn very quickly. You learn very quickly, and plus you go out and you hear Billy Hart, you hear Al Foster, you hear Goodman, you hear all these guys, and you say, okay, I got to up my game here. So you grow quickly.
You're right in the thick of things.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder if it's, well, I don't mean pandemic time, if it's still like that in New York City, where you can play pre-pandemic, of course, where you could play so much and learn. I see Joe Farnsworth's videos and whatnot, and he's an absolutely fabulous drummer. But I wonder if New York still is the same kind of thing, if there's enough places to play. You know, I wonder. I'm not sure.
Well, I speak occasionally with Adam Nussbaum and Billy and Matt Wilson and the guys that are in New York, Riley, and I think the scene is the same or similar in that there are places to play if there's no pandemic, of course. Now, the Vanguard does streaming, live streaming concerts. I think not Steamers, Smoke does live streaming concerts. So those kinds of opportunities exist. I watched a tremendous concert with Christian McBride and Lovano and Sko and Eric Harland, and Tane. This was for Joe Biden's campaign. That was socially distanced outside of the winery. Obviously, the volume of work is not there, and people that were counting on that good strong month in the summertime touring in Europe, that doesn't exist anymore either. But I hope it comes back. It's got to, man.
It will. I think at some point, there is a vaccine, and where people want to argue about things like that, it's but that's an incredible time. So you spoke about playing with some other folks. Now I have here on my notes that you played with Tony Bennett, and it's hilarious. I was reading an interview, and you said that your timing was not great because the artists that you had played with, they had broken and become very well known after you had left, and so that's pretty funny. You said the same kind of thing about Chuck Mangione having the big hits in the late 70s, and as well as Tony Bennett. But Tony was definitely already a living legend at that point. When did you start playing with Tony Bennett?
My first gig with Tony was New Year's Eve of 1981 in Manila. Bill Evans died in September of 1980, September 15th. And I had, the rest of that year, nothing was happening for me. And of course, Tony knew me from Woody's band. He knew me from Bill's trio. And his bass player, John Burr, recommended me to Tony, and they reached out, and I joined Tony then.
What makes you a first call drummer rather than somebody that's been in the city or been in the scene for a long time? What is it that Joe La Barbera has that the other drummers may not?
I think there were a number of drummers in New York that could have done that job equally as well, honestly, Neil. It's just that I was recommended by John Burr. Tony knew me. In fact, I saw Tony in February of 1980. He came to see me play with Jimmy Rolls and George Mraz at a club called Michael's Pub. And Tony came in because, he was a fan of Jimmy Rolls. So, and Carol Sloan, who was singing that evening as well. So Tony showed up and we spoke then. Honestly, it's just a question of being in the right place at the right time. A lot of times, and just being present, being there, being on the scene, and having. I mean, I have to admit, I did have a relatively higher profile because I was playing all the time in New York, But it's just one of those things, or I don't know, just good fortune, I guess.
Good fortune, and you were prepared. And it's funny. I think that parrot might have been talking about you as well, like the entire family, not just your dad. But that is pretty unbelievable. Any favorite places that you've been to in the world that you've played? Any particular festival or gig that is a standout, or a few of them?
Well, I'll give you one with Tony Bennett, for example. When you say that Tony Bennett was an established star, well, that may be true. His name was well known. But when I joined Tony, he was struggling to come back from a very, very dry period. He had a falling out with his record label. He didn't have a contract. So we were doing a lot of industrial gigs. The stuff that most people of his stature would not want to do, but we did a ton of that stuff.
Mm.
So it was a climb back. And in 1990, so I joined him in 1981. In 1986, we recorded The Art of Excellence.
Okay.
And in 1987, I think he was nominated for a Grammy. So he was asked to perform at the Grammy Awards in New York City at Radio City Music Hall. And if you've been to Radio City Music Hall, you know that the stage is sunken. You can have the orchestra in view or out of view. So we were all down below, and they announced Tony Bennett. And as we started to play, the riser started to come up, and I looked out in the audience, and it was packed, and people were like on their feet for Tony, screaming and yelling. And the hair on the back of my neck stood up, because I realized now this is what you have to do to really to succeed. He was committed to something that he wanted to sing, he wanted to record. He didn't want to record tunes that he didn't love. And he stuck to that, even through those very, very lean times. And when that riser came out, and I realized, okay, man, you are right back where you belong, man, because you deserve to be here. He had that crowd in the palm of his hand. That's probably one of the most memorable moments. I mean, we played command performances for the Queen and Di and Charles and all that, but that one right there was Tony actually finding himself again, or let's say that everyone else found him again.
That's incredible. The victory and just pursuing that, or having the artistic integrity. People make fun of that, saying you can't buy a sandwich with artistic integrity. But there's you have to have a vision, and you as well. Has a parallel story where you were playing with these artists, and you're playing jazz, which is a very challenging kind of music. It's the upper echelon for drummers. And here you are also celebrating in your own way, along with Tony, celebrating that victory together. And that is amazing. I was picturing that as you were telling that story. I imagine there was an awful lot of brush playing with Tony.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And who are your brush idols? I know there's Ed Thigpen comes to mind, and of course Clayton Cameron, and Buddy Rich is an incredible brush player. If people don't know this, they need to check out Buddy's brush playing. Who were some of the people that you looked up to for that?
Since you mentioned Buddy, I'm going to tell everybody to right now go to wherever you get your music and pull up Lester Young Trio with Nat Cole on piano and Buddy Rich on drums playing I Want to Be Happy. I heard that track when I was a kid, and it stuck with me all these years. But I mean, my main brush influence was Shelley, man.
Oh.
Once I heard Shelley, the sound, and the inventiveness of how he played. I loved Philly's brush playing. Of course, I loved Ed Thigpen's brush playing. But those artists were the ones that shaped the sound in my head about how I wanted the brushes to sound. My father, intuitively, or maybe not so intuitively, maybe he was a lot smarter than I give him credit for, which I give him a lot of credit for. When I was 5 or 6 years old, I remember one of the first lessons I had is he had me sit down with my snare drum with a pair of brushes and practice double stroke rolls with the brushes.
Like Alan Dawson.
Yeah. So, those things are really what formed my approach. And then just having the brushes in your hand, I tell my students now, the difference between you and me is that I've had these brushes in my hands longer. If you decide you're going to pick them up and use them, you're going to develop skills very naturally because you'll be playing with them, you know. And I think a lot of students don't realize that that's all they really need to be doing. Of course, you need some guidance along the way, but if you just pick them up and try and have them in your hands. For me, as a teenager playing dance jobs around, you know, my hometown, I would have the brushes in my hand at least 70% of the night, maybe even 80% of the night. That's the way it was done, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, with Tony, there was quite a bit of brush playing, and of course with Bill Evans, there was a lot of brush playing. And I
Right.
think with Bill is where I developed the majority of my skills with the brushes because, you know, if you know anything about Bill Evans, and I know you do, you realize that he didn't want the time to be expressed the same way that, like, say, Ed Thigpen or Philly would do it. You know, I mean, well, Philly, of course, worked with him, but it wasn't where you just picked a pattern and you stuck with it all night long. You had to be more, you had to be freer than that, and that, because of the music, because of what he was playing, what that music was asking me for. I had to come up with something different, and every drummer that worked with him had, I sure experienced the same thing.
That is incredible. Wow. We talk a little bit about your teaching career. When did you begin teaching, and why?
Well, you know, just like 2 years ago, when I decided I didn't want to tour anymore, in 1993, my daughter was ready for high school, and I wanted her to come out. My wife and I, at the time, had divorced, so we had been divorced, I think, 4 or 5 years by then. I wanted her to come and live with me for high school, so I was trying to find a way to not be on the road.
Right.
And
Hmm.
all of a sudden, right out of the sky, this thing fell because Tootie Heath had been teaching at Cal Arts, and Ray Brown was reorganizing the modern jazz quartet, which was going to get those guys out there. He was going to be their manager, and he was their manager.
Wow.
So he was going to get them back out there, and Connie Kay had passed, sadly. So Percy Heath was the bass player, and they said, well, let's get Tootie. And so Tootie was going to go out. I met David Roystein through Larry Kuntz, who's also at Cal Arts, at an IAJE convention where they heard me play with a big band. And on the plane ride home, Dave tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, can we get lunch?" And so we got lunch, and then like a week later, I was meeting with the dean, and then in September, I started in 1993. So that's how that whole thing got started.
That's incredible. What does your curriculum look like? Or how did it change over the years? Man, I have so many questions for you. Holy smokes. I'm sorry, Joe. But what is it that you teach as at the school, or what did you teach?
I teach along similar lines of what I learned from Alan Dawson. So there is a large measure of the fundamentals, technique, reading. You know, you have to have snare drum skills. You have to have good snare drum skills if you're going to be a drummer. And it's going to just make life easier. So there's a large dose of that, and there's a large dose of actual drum set playing. Now, over the years, it's evolved tremendously. And I also draw on listening to the greats and playing the transcriptions of some of the greats. And I always caution, there's a certain type of student that thinks that playing somebody else's solo is going to somehow inhibit their creativity, which is just nonsense.
Right.
I mean, there's recordings of Charlie Parker playing along with Lionel Hampton records. I mean, Louis Armstrong copied Nick LaRocca from the original Dixieland Jazz Band guy. I mean, so these things happen. You have to come from somewhere. So I always caution the students, I don't want you to sound like this particular drummer. I want you to grab some of this person's spirit. I want you to get a little bit of the juice that this person's bringing to the music and put it into your vocabulary. It's just like, there really is no standard repertoire for drum set, right, Neil? I mean, it's not like somebody that plays the piano and they're going to play the Goldberg variation spot, right? Or the Closet book for saxophone or the Arbenz book for trumpet. We don't have that. We have snare drum literature, but for the drum set, for my money, the best thing you could do. And now today, with all of the great drummers beyond jazz, right, in all styles of music, there's so many that you can pick. you need to access that stuff as your standard repertoire and learn your drum set by walking in their shoes for a little bit.
That's wonderful advice. I remember Jim Blackley saying that a lot of people, a lot of young drummers want to do their own thing. He says, you want to do your own thing. How can you do your own thing when you don't have anything to do something with? So you need to learn some fundamentals, and you need to just check out the history. As far as rhythm section playing, did you teach that? Is that something that you were teaching at Cal Arts as well, playing with the rhythm section and teaching young drummers how to do that or guide them?
You know, initially we had a rhythm section class that I taught, but then we as a faculty decided, this was very early on, we decided, you know what, the best thing we can offer these kids in terms of playing experience is for us to be in the band with them.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I play with my ensemble. My drummers get to play with Larry Kuntz, Derek Oles, David Roystein, Paul Novros, Steve Lehman. You know, they get to play with these people in their bands, right? And they learn that way. Because if you're standing right next to me as a bass player and I'm giving you something to work with, you know, you're going to pick it up much more quickly. Or as a soloist, if you can hear what I'm playing and how I'm trying to help you play, you're going to grow as quickly as I grew playing with better players when I hit the scene in New York. So that's kind of how we approach it.
That's amazing. Wow, what an experience. And what other things, what other subjects would you teach at Cal Arts? Anything other than just playing jazz?
Well, I teach jazz history. I've taught that course for since 1996, and I love that. I love that class, man. I've learned so much myself, and it gives me an opportunity to go back and fill in some gaps in my own knowledge about you know, artists like Louis Armstrong and how incredibly important they are. And then when I get up to the period of the 60s going forward, and I'm able to actually speak with some firsthand experience about these people because I heard them play or I played with them, you know, that helped. I love that aspect of it, but I just love the opportunity of ensuring in some small way that the history of this music is not going to be forgotten or neglected, and it's never going to be neglected. But I'm just doing what I can so that the people that come into my class come away with a better understanding of how these artists contributed to the music and how the music today is really not that much different than the music from the 30s. It's just stylistically different, but the approach is pretty much the same.
Absolutely. We had Anthony McKelly here, a wonderful,
Yeah, I know Anthony. Hey.
and he's commenting here saying, like the good old days on the bandstand, you'll learn by doing, and you have instant feedback from somebody who is a working professional drummer. I wanted to ask you, is those history of jazz, is that available online at all? I would absolutely love something like that, or is that only done in real time and not possible?
I've recorded several of the classes this year. You know, we have our own site at Cal Arts. It's
Yeah.
the Cal Arts Learn site where we're all teaching our courses now. But I haven't actually made this a class outside of Cal Arts. I'm going to be retiring from Cal Arts in May after 27 years. You know, my wife and I are both going to retire in May from our day jobs. And maybe at that time I will consider I'll consider putting together a jazz history course because it is something that I really love to do.
I don't know how many times I've watched the Ken Burns jazz, and I'm hungry for a lot of those kinds of things. And I know a lot of other people would be. I mean, I'm in my 50s. I can't go back to music college at this point and do that. Believe me, if I could, if I'd won the lottery, that's what I would be doing. Is I would be going back and playing and flying to California when it's safe and seeing Joe La Barbera for a tune-up. Um, where do you do any online or private lessons, Skype lessons for anyone?
Yeah, I have a handful of drummers that have reached out to me recently. I mean, there's some that I've had for a while, but we do a regular Zoom lesson. Yeah, and I mean, it's just what we're all doing now. I mean, I'll show. I mean, here I am in my. There's my drums and there's my microphones and I got cameras.
You
Yeah,
know, I never even asked you about what your drum kits were. I've just been so uh, raptured by your story thus far, and I know we've gotten a little bit on so many different subjects. But what are those drums that you have right beside you there, or behind you?
you got to be kidding. They're Gretsch.
Oh, I know. What are the sizes?
I'm
Yeah,
teasing. I'm teasing you, man. Hold on a second.
that's me. There. Oh,
These are the drums I got from Gretsch in 1975 when I signed with them. And this is the same kit that I played with Chuck, with
oh,
Woody, and with Bill Evans and everybody else in between. I had the bass drum refinished recently by Paul Cooper at Gretsch because it had a lot of cosmetic blemishes.
yeah.
And at the same time, he redid this drum, which is a Gretsch Gladstone. He redid that finish for me as well. Came out
Oh,
just beautiful. Yeah. So these are as you can see, they're stop sign badge,
yes.
1975. Beautiful drums. I put these wooden hoops on because I was
Yeah.
curious about how they were going to sound. And I gotta say, man, this drum is amazing. It just kills. I mean, when you want a rim shot with that hoop, it just sounds fantastic.
That is incredible. Oh, I saw somewhere online where you were saying that you like wood hoops. It might have been when you were at Stan and Gary's shop there, where you've spent 50 or 60 bucks in a bunch of years. You know, at least. I I have to go to pro is it Pro Drum in Hollywood there? I've got to get there one of these days. I almost did twice now when I was out in California playing. But Joe, we are almost out of time, and I can't thank you enough for your kindness and being so flexible, and then joining Instagram just so that we could do this. And I will repost this. And I was so giddy. I was so excited the last couple of days, knowing that we were going to be chatting. And it's funny. Yeah, okay, I'm going to stop now. But where can people find you on the web?
Wow.
Right here.
I guess so, man. I mean, we had our own, four of us had our own label called Jazz Compass for many years. Larry Koontz, Clay Jenkins, and Tom Orange and myself, and then my brother John. And we shut that down last year. So I don't even have a website. When you mentioned earlier to your listeners that this could be an issue of me and technology, you weren't far off the mark. But I really do need to get a website going here. I think you're just going to have to do some Google searching, man.
Yeah, plenty. I found plenty from Drummer World and different sites. And Facebook, you have a Facebook page as
I
well.
do have a Facebook page. And also, one thing I'll just throw your way right now is that in early December, I'm doing something for Gretsch called Gretsch Generations.
You are doing that. Fantastic.
We are
Okay.
with my neighbor and longtime friend Gary Novak.
Oh,
He will be the younger, and I will be the elder
that is
of the generation.
well,
So I'm looking forward to that.
looking forward to that as well. And I will reach out to you. I'd love to send you a message. I would love to do a Zoom lesson, and
Sure. Yeah.
and that would be a thrill for me. And I want to learn some more. I'm here in the drum room here, but I'm hungry for some input, and especially from someone who's got the fruit on the tree. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. Thanks for the comments. Thank you, Mr. Joe La Barbera, for your time, your wonderful stories. Hopefully we could do a part 2, but I will definitely talk to you sooner than later. And everyone, tune in next week for episode 33 of the Gretsch Afternoon Drum Break. Everybody take care.
See you, Neil.
Thanks, Joe. Bye-bye.